The first page of your notes has a polynomial long division problem worked out step by step. I'm not going to go over the example that's already worked out step by step. I'm going to go over example number 2 after we talk about the terminology. What is a divisor? The divisor is the number on the outside that's being divided into the 24. The answer of a division problem is called a quotient. Okay, so we are going to look at example number 2. Are you in the right place? Now, example number 2 talks about a factor. Before we talk about polynomial factors, what are the factors of 12? 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Why are those factors of 12? Okay, I hear many things. Would you agree that if I divide any of those numbers into 12, I will get a whole number answer? Is there any remainder when I divide those into 12? Is 5 a factor of 12? Because it doesn't divide evenly. Okay, so if this is going to be a factor of this quadratic, it has to divide evenly. Let me show you how to divide polynomials. On my paper, I've spread my examples out where they're pretty big. You need to kind of write small on your notes or you won't be able to fit your problem on your paper. Just like whole number division, I look at this first number. What am I going to have to multiply this by so that it will equal x squared? Just like my whole number division, I have columns that represent place value. In my whole number example, we have 5, 10s, 100s, thousands. In my polynomial example, we have constants without x, x to the first power, x squared, and then x to the third power would come next. And so we line this up in the x column. So next, I multiply this x times that x, and I get x squared. And I multiply this x times 4, and I get positive 4x. I just multiplied this x times both of those. Then the next step is to subtract. You will make less sign mistakes if you think of subtraction as changing the signs and adding up the columns. Change the signs and add up the columns. The x squareds cancel out, and a 2x comes down. And then you bring down the next number. What do I need to multiply x by so it would equal 2x? So then I multiply the 2 times the x. And I multiply the 2 times the 8. And I need to subtract. To subtract, change the signs, and add up the column. Stop talking. There is no remainder. The answer is 0. If the answer is 0, that means that x plus 4 is a factor, because the answer right there was a 0. The first one is easier than the next several problems. We usually start out with an easy problem and then work our way up to the more difficult problems. In this problem, it asks if the x plus 4 is a factor. I don't know why it's... So, I need to divide the x plus 4 into x to the third power plus 3x squared minus 6x minus 7. I'm dividing this into that. This on your papers at the top of the page. What do I need to multiply x by so it equals x to the third power? I have to multiply this times the x and also times the 4. I multiply it by both of those. I need to subtract. You will make fewer sign mistakes if you think of subtracting as adding the opposite using your integer rules. This cancels out. What's 3 plus negative 4? What am I going to have to multiply x by so it's going to equal negative 1x squared? You can put the 1 or leave it out. Negative 1x times an x. Negative 1x times 4. I need to subtract. Subtracting is the same thing as adding the opposite. So the x squareds cancel out. And bring down the negative 7. X multiplies by negative 2 to equal negative 2x. And so I'm going to need to multiply by negative 2. This negative 2 is going to multiply by the x, and it's also going to multiply by the 4. So this is going to be negative 2x minus 8. I need to subtract. Subtract is the same thing as adding the opposite. So the 2's cancel out, and this is a 1. It has a remainder of 1. So what does that mean? X plus 4 is not a factor, because that is a 1, it is not a 0. That does not divide evenly. Come up. I am going to divide this polynomial by this polynomial. The 2x minus 5 divides into the 2x to the third power minus 9x squared. Stop. You must have every term accounted for. You must have an x term. But this doesn't have an x term. So I have to have an x term down here to keep all the columns lined up correctly. And so I have to put in a 0x as a placeholder because this polynomial does not have an x. Hold on. I already have a 2, so I don't need to multiply by a 2. I just need to multiply by x squared. And I'm going to multiply the x squared times that term and times that term. The next step is dividing. On dividing is subtracting. Subtracting is the same thing as adding the opposite. Change the signs and add the columns. The 2's cancel, and this one right here is equal to 4x squared. Bring down the next column. This might explain a little bit better for you why I have to have a 0 here. So what do I multiply 2 by so that it would be equal to -4? And I also need to multiply by an x. If I multiply that by the 2, I get -2 times -5 would be that's why I have to have a 0 here, because I can't add that to a 15 that doesn't have an x. And so I have to have that placeholder so that my columns will add up correctly. I need to subtract. To subtract, you change the signs and add up the columns. And bring down the 15. This is a +2, this is a -10, so I'm going to need to multiply by a -5. -5 times 2 is -10x. -5 times -5 is +25. Change the signs and add up the columns. There is a remainder. That means that the 2x minus 5 is not a factor. This next problem asks about volume. What does volume have to do with any of this? You even remember what volume is? Do you remember that volume is length times width times height? This is the x minus 6 is the height. And it asks me to find the dimensions. The other dimensions would be the length and the width. It gives me the height, and the other dimensions are the length and the width. Well, what does this have to do with this dividing stuff? Well, I'm going to divide the height into the volume. How do I divide this? Okay, what am I going to need to multiply x by? So it's going to be equal to 6x to the third. So I multiply that, and it's 6x to the third. Positive 6 times negative 6 is negative 36x squared, and I need to subtract that. To subtract, you change the signs and add the columns. So that's going to be 1x squared minus 41x. So I need to multiply by x, or 1x. X times x is 1x squared. X times negative 6 is negative 6x. Subtract. Subtracting is the same as changing the signs and adding up the columns. The ones cancel. Bring down the next term, the 210. Yes, because it is to the third power, and when I started, and so this is going to have one more term than my previous example. And so x already has an x, so I need to multiply by negative 35. Negative 35 times x. Negative times negative would make a positive. 35 times 6 is 210. Change signs and add up the column, and the answer is 0. It has to be 0 because otherwise this would not be the height. The height has to go into this evenly. Now, it asks for the dimensions. The dimensions for volume are length and width and height. We have the height given to us. How can we find the length and the width? What you would do to find the length and the width, now that this is a quadratic, you would factor the quadratic. This has a coefficient bigger than 1, so you would multiply the first term times the last term, find the factors of 210, and do factor by grouping. We're not going to do that part today. We're just going to focus on the dividing because that's difficult enough. And so I believe you have one final example. We are going to skip that example for now so you can get started on your assignment.